Today is Tuesday, February 11th, 2025, and welcome to episode number 37 of the Phillies Fan Podcast. I'm your host, Jaden Harper. The Phillies have had an offseason. Today is the day they report to spring trading down in Clearwater. They've had an offseason filled with a couple of moves, some flying way under the radar, while others getting more national attention. We're going to look at those moves, but before we do, I do remind you to make sure to like and subscribe. We're going to be covering the Phillies this whole season, this entire 2025 year, so make sure to like and subscribe. So let's start off with the biggest one, Jesus Luzardo. Luzardo was acquired in a trade from the Marlins. He didn't pitch that much last year, dealing with a back injury, which kept him on the sidelines for majority of the 2024 season. His last start was in June against the Nationals. He didn't have a great year. He pitched to around a 5 ERA for Miami, but in 2023 he pitched at an all-star level. He was their ace after Sandy Alcantara went down with an injury, and he really stepped up, and he ended up starting game one of the National League Wildcard Series back in 2023 against the Phillies. He took the loss. The Phillies ended up sweeping the Marlins that year, but the Phillies were able to acquire him. They also got catcher Paul McIntosh from the Miami Marlins. They traded Starlin Caba to Miami. He was one of the Phillies' top prospects. He was number 5, I'm pretty sure, in the system at the time of the trade. And you look at Luzardo, right? He only pitched 66 innings last year, but it's not an arm injury, which is less of a concern when you look at a back injury for Luzardo. Arm injuries, the Phillies have been very lucky with that, not having to deal with those. Back injuries are something you can more manage than an arm that could get worse and worse over time. So he's under contract through the 2026 season, so he'd be in Philly this year. They'd also be in Philly the following year, so he has team control. So he's going to be one of the big pieces in this starting rotation now with the Phillies. When you add him along with Zach Wheeler, Aaron Nola, Christopher Sanchez, and Ranger Suarez, they build now one of the best rotations in Major League Baseball. This rotation had a really, really good year last year, right? They won the division for the first time, right? And Wheeler had a great season, second in NL Cy Young voting. You have Ranger Suarez, who at first looked like he was on pace to be the National League Cy Young. Christopher Sanchez had an incredible season. He got extended, and Aaron Nola had another consistent season. And this move also kind of shows a changing of a guard in Philly, considering you look at Ranger Suarez, he's a free agent after this year, unlikely to sign an extension. This move, getting Luzardo, might mean that Suarez is on his way out after the 2025 season, which is something to watch for during the season. But for now, the Phillies have a absolutely loaded rotation. It's the best one they've had in their last couple of years as they try to compete for another championship with this roster that is perfectly capable of doing it. The Phillies also added a long reliever type in Joe Ross, the former National, played in Washington. He was a part of the 2019 World Series team with current Philly Trey Turner. He actually ended up starting Game 5 of the World Series for Max Scherzer, who was dealing with back spasms. He did take the loss, but he did get a ring with Washington. He was in Milwaukee last year, pitched in the postseason, had a good year. All considered under a 4 ERA. He pitched some as a starter. He pitched some as a reliever, right? And he is going to be one of those versatile guys for the Phillies, right? You have Andrew Painter. He's coming back, around probably June, July, most would expect, right? So you look at a guy like Joe Ross. If the Phillies need a sixth starter, they don't want to go to Taijuan Walker, right? They could go to Joe Ross, right? But if they also need a guy to eat up innings after a bad start, or just on everybody, the bullpen is taxed, they could go to Joe Ross, and Joe Ross could also become a guy who could get big innings and shut down hitters later and later into the season if the Phillies need him to fill in that role. So the Phillies really got a guy here who could do multiple things and could really, be a piece that could be valuable to the Phillies, and a piece that also has postseason experience, which is huge considering this team is looking to go deep in the postseason, right? But that's not the only addition to the bullpen this offseason. They also added Jordan Romano from the Toronto Blue Jays. The Blue Jays non-tendered Romano At the end of their season, Romano signed with the Phillies on a 1 year deal worth around $8.5 million, which is honestly a bargain for a guy who made multiple All Stars appearances. He was one of the best relievers in MLB on a 3 year stretch from 2021 to 2023. 2024 was an injury riddled season for Romano, around a 6 ERA, right? And he didn't have his best start and only best stuff, but that was in a 15-game sample size, right? It wasn't the Romano we're used to seeing. It was a really different type of Romano. He was dealing with his elbow issues, which is, something to be a little concerned about if you're the Phillies, right? You want to make sure you have a guy who's going to be healthy, but he showed that he could be a back end closer and be healthy throughout his career, right? He went in Toronto, he had a 2.37 ERA in a 3 year stretch. And 2 of those years, Toronto were a playoff team, right? He made the All Star game 2 of those years. He was one of the AL's best relievers. He had an off year last year, but I think people forget how good Jordan Romano was during his heyday, I would say, with the Toronto Blue Jays. And he could pitch in Philly, which is sometimes a hitter's ballpark, but it can become a pitcher's ballpark if you play to the defense. The Phillies have one of the best defenses in Major League Baseball, depending on the roster of the players they put out there. You add, a guy like Romano, he could get strikeouts, but he could also try to get, fielding outs. Yeah, put the ball in play, force hitters to put the ball in play, and his defenders will do something with it. So I think Romano is going to fit in perfectly with this team, right? I would believe he'll probably get closing opportunities to start the year, right? But him, Alvarado, Straub, Kettering, it's going to be another year of the Phillies doing this closer by committee, and it's worked, right? They've made the postseason the last 3 years. So I would say with Romano, he's going to be a big, big piece at the back end of this bullpen to help the Phillies really contend in 2025 and tighten up the bullpen, because that was a big issue going down the stretch last year, right? During the playoffs against the Mets, the bullpen had a 10 ERA, which is really not going to win you series. You look back at game one of that series, the Phillies had a 1-0 lead going into the eighth inning, and it collapsed basically. It really collapsed, and the Mets were able to take game one. The Phillies blew the lead in game two, got the lead back, right? They were down, came back, took the lead in the eighth, gave up runs in the ninth. They ended up walking it off. And then game 3 and 4, the bullpen also struggled, right? So you look, you lose a guy like Carlos Estevez. He sides with the Royals. You lose a guy who was a big, big piece to the back end in Jeff Hoffman to the Blue Jays. That's a whole nother thing with his arm and his shoulder and medical, considering 2 teams failed a physical on Jeff Hoffman, right? So the Phillies, they lose 2 key pieces at the back end of their bullpen, but they get a guy like Romano. I think that's going to really help. They also think that Kettering is going to take steps forward, right? This is going to only be his second full major league season. He came up with about 10 days left in the 2023 season. He missed about the first month of the 2024 season, right? So now he'll probably finally have his first full season in the big leagues, and he'll be able to take strides and develop more, right? You don't know who's going to end up potentially leaving the rotation. If Painter gets a rotation spot or the Phillies make a trade at the deadline, is Ranger Suarez going to be in the bullpen? And what he could do out of the pen. That's how he really got started back in 2021. He was a closer. He was the best Phillies closer on that team that really, really struggled at that position. So he could be a potential piece in the bullpen, right? The Phillies have enough pitching to go deep in October this year. That's what you saw with the Dodgers last year, right? They have their bullpen, and they had to go bullpen games in game 4 of the NLCS and then in the World Series. The Dodgers won game 4 in the NLCS. They lost it in the World Series, but it shows the depth of the Dodgers bullpen, which is one of the main reasons why, outside of Freddie Freeman, that they won the World Series. And the Phillies, I feel like, are trying to follow that blueprint a little, right? Because the bullpen has kind of held them back in the past. But I think this is the bullpen that will help the Phillies get over the hump and win the World Series. Phillies also added a bat this offseason. They signed veteran outfielder Max Kepler to a 1-year deal worth $10 million. German Max Kepler had an offseason last year for the Minnesota Twins. He dealt with some injuries, right? He wasn't at the same level that he used to be, right? But he's had, flashes of greatness during his time in Minnesota. And interestingly enough, it comes up on these odd years 23, 21, 19. He's had his best seasons. He's part of that Bomba squad. He's hit 30 home runs in a year before. And I feel like he's going to do really good in Philadelphia, considering, right field is meant for lefties. You've seen the Ryan Howards, the Jim Tomes. You've seen the Kyle Schwarbers, right? Dominic Brown during his stretch with the Phillies, right? They've all hit well. Bryce Harper, all hit well in Citizens Bank Park because that right field is, it's a hitter's ballpark and it's a hitter's paradise in right field for lefties. And Kepler is going to come from Minnesota, which isn't, the easiest place to hit, to Philadelphia, where he could, I think, could easily hit 20, 25 home runs this year. He'll probably be on the back end of the Phillies lineup. We'll go over that in another episode, but he could be a piece that really helps the Phillies in the outfield, right? Last year their outfield for most of the year consisted of Brandon Marsh, Johan Rojas, and Nick Castellanos. Castellanos is going to be in right field this year, and the question is, who's going to be the center fielder? Is Marsh going to be getting everyday reps, right? They usually didn't play him against lefties going down the stretch. The Phillies had Austin Hayes last year. He's now in Cincinnati. So who, is Marsh going to get those everyday at bats? Or is Rojas going to be, platooning with Marsh? You look at that, right? Is Kepler going to be the everyday left fielder? Max Kepler has never played left field in the MLB. So this is going to be a first time for him playing in that position. How will he do, right? And then you look at, I would say there's two questions out of the three positions in the outfield. Kepler, I would think, will be fine. Left field is one of the easier positions to try to figure out. And for Kepler, he could really focus more on his offense, because if the defense lacks, there could always be the late game, replacement. You saw it back in 2022 when the Phillies made their deep run. They, pulled players, they moved pieces around late in the game. They could do that with Kepler, but he has a good glove in the outfield, so I think he's going to be a really valuable asset to be the everyday left fielder for the Phillies. But the Phillies really, I think they made their team better. They're here to compete. They're here to try to win a title this year, and I think this is the team to do it. The guys they brought in were all injured at points last year. They all missed. They were all spent time on the 60-day IL last year, which is something you can be a little concerned about. Obviously, the Phillies have been pretty lucky, and they haven't dealt with major injuries. So you look at, in this recent run, these four players, they were hurt on 60-day IL last year, but when they were on the field, especially when they were on the field and healthy, they really, really produced. So it'll be interesting to see how the Rob Thompson and the Phillies integrate them, how they get them starting spring training and leading up to opening day, which is now 44 days away, how they really work these players in and what the lineup looks like on opening day. But I will be going over the lineup for opening day this Friday, episode 38, so make sure to stay tuned for that. Next week, I'll start covering each division in baseball. We'll do the East next week, AL on Tuesday, the National League East on Thursday, and then I'll also be live next Sunday, February 23rd, when the Phillies take on the Baltimore Orioles in their second spring training game. But thank you for watching this video on the Phillies offseason editions. Make sure to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. I'm Jaden Harper, and I'll see you on the next one.